All right, Shabbosai, good morning, a good Chodesh, a lichtige Chanukah. Beautiful way to start the new month together. Really, Yashikoch to everyone, especially Yashikoch to Rabbi Yehuda Buchwalter for for sponsoring this morning's breakfast in honor of Chanukah, in honor of Rosh Chodesh, and a tremendous Yashikoch to Saeed for always, literally, Chavre, you don't realize, he gives up half of his own davening to go ahead and prepare breakfast for everyone else, which is, I know many people might give up davening to do a lot of different things, right? But say he's actually someone who wouldn't rather give up davening, but mamish to go ahead and to facilitate a pleasurable and beautiful experience for all of us, he does that. So Saeed, tremendous yashikoch, thank you for everything you do. Say with that, let us begin. Let's begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves. Haba Aleinu L'Tova. The shiurim this month are dedicated by the Daf Yomi Shiur in memory of Mr. Marder, Mordechai Dovid ben Rephael HaKohen. We hope that in the merit of his Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah in the family, a neshama. To thank Shirley Elbaum Family for dedicating the shiurim this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel, R Avraham Menachem, Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family, a neshama. I will say with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Actually, not so much to do. Well, yes, there is a lot to do today. In general, in life. The daf happens to be a little bit shorter, but Amir Tzachon will say very rewarding. So let's begin. Today's daf is Samech Aleph, 61. Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, thank you. You were out back. Thank you so very much. Really, really beautiful. Really beautiful. We should do this every day. That'll be great. We'll also then space the tables out a little bit more, as people extend. And so really, and thank you. And while we're giving our cards to, because Chanukah Mamish is Yom Tov Hoda, a tremendous thank you and shkoyach to Ari Lerner for always preparing the coffee and always making sure. Without coffee, nothing in life happens without coffee. Especially, again, early morning Daf Yomi, and that Rabbi makes sure that whether he's here or he delegates the responsibility to someone else, make sure that Baruch Hashem always happens. So Ari, thank you. On behalf of the entire Shir, Shkoyach Gadol, thank you. I'll say, okay, let's go back to this. So today's Daf is Samech Aleph, Amud Aleph 61a. We are actually picking up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. So I just want to close out yesterday's sugi. I realized I could have closed it out at the end of Shir, but we were out of time. If you remember again, in yesterday's daf, we spoke about 3 different cases. We spoke about konam yayin she'eni toim hayom, or konam yayin she'eni toim yom echad. What's the difference between hayom and yom echad? Hayom means what? A little chazara. Hayom means today, which means calendrical day until nightfall, versus Yom Echad, which means 24 hours. What you call in halacha often me'es le'es, 24 hours. The Gemara ended off with a shaila of what happens if a person just says Yom. Konam yayin she'eni toim Yom. What is Yom? Is Yom like Yom Echad? Is Yom like Hayom? So the Gemara tries to prove it. Rabbi said the way the sugya ends is totally inconclusive. So if you look at the Ran on Samech Aleph Amud Aleph 61a, on the left-hand side, the first short line. So the Ran says, "U'le'inyan halacha kevan debayin lo ifshita." Since we didn't answer this question, therefore naktinon l'chumra diyom ki yom echad dami va'asr me'es le'es. Rabbi said the Gemara says something very interesting, that ultimately at the end of the day we don't really answer the question. The Gemara doesn't really resolve it. So therefore, any time you don't have resolution on a halachic issue, what are you going to do? You're going to go to Chumrah. So therefore, because we can't prove whether Yom is like Yom Echad or Hayom, ultimately, again, therefore it's going to be Asr for a 24-hour period. That becomes the Chumrah. So essentially, I will say, the default Chumrah is that Yom becomes like Yom Echad. Okay, good. With that, let's go back to Yibayluhu. So let's listen to this. Amar Yayin Shani Toim Yovel. So we'll say this is such an interesting case over here. Person says, I take a neder that I'm not going to drink wine for a Yovel. For a Yovel. So what's the halacha? So my shnas chamishim kilifnei chamishim or kila achar chamishim. So we'll say, so what does that mean? So now, when he gets, let's assume we'll say that it's like this year. This is the first year of a Shemitah cycle. So now, if I say, I'm not going to go ahead and drink wine for a Yovel, so what does that mean? Does that mean I'm not allowed to drink wine through the 50th year? or up until the 50th year. So my shnas chamishim kilifnim, is the 50th year included in the neder, or kila achar chamishim, or is year 50 considered to be kind of, meaning the neder extends up until year 50, but year 50 is already post-neder. So which one is it? So Tashma will say, let's analyze this. This is really quite interesting. The Sanyo, Pluted Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. So we'll say, in reality, there's a brayso that contains machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. What's the machlokes? Here we go. So the pasuk says, "V'kidashtem es shnasa chamishim shana." So the pasuk says, "You shall consecrate or sanctify the 50th year." So what do we see from here? Shnasa chamishim atamona, v'atamona shnas chamishim v'achos. So I will say, listen to this. We're going to see now a fundamental machlokes in how you look at the Shemitah. Well, remember, when is the Shemitah year? What is the Shemitah year? The 50th year. But specifically, when does it occur? After 7 Shemitah cycles. Right? So you have 7 Shemitah cycles. That gives you 49 years. And then the 50th year, i.e. the year after the end of the 7th Shemitah cycle, is the Yovel year. 50. And we'll say, what's the Shaila? Is year 50 also count as year 1 of the next cycle? Right? In other words, we'll say, so remember, technically speaking, if that 50th year wasn't a Yovel year, what would that 50th year be? What would it be? Year 1 of cycle number 8. That's what it would be. So that's the Shaila. When you observe a Yovel year, is a Yovel year 50 and also year 51? In other words, does it count as the 50th year, but that 50th year is also year 1 of the new cycle? Or no? Maybe year 50 is year 50, and when does year 1 of the 8th cycle begin? In what we call year 51. Year 51. So that's the Shaila. Does the Yovel year count both as the 50th year and as the first year of the new cycle or not? So therefore the Gemara says over here, you shall sanctify the 50th year. So the Gemara says, Shnasa chamishim atamona. Teaches us, Yovel is counted only as year 50, V'i atamona shnas chamishim v'achos. But it does not count as year 51. Does not count as year 51. They both say, take a quick look at the Rush for just a moment. Actually, before we go, Mikan Amru, from here we say, Yovel einu ola leminyan shavua. That Yovel does not count as year 1 towards the 8th cycle. Yovel is year 50, but it does not count as year number 1 in the 8th Shemitah cycle. I will say, take a quick look at the Rush. This is really quite interesting. Quick look at the Rush. It's like right in the middle of the Rush. Shnas chamishim atamona v'atamona shnas chamishim v'achas. Kilomar, shnas chamishim atamona letashlim yovel sha'avar v'atamona osa lios echad liyovel haba. The 50th year, I will say, is the conclusion of the previous Yovel cycle. So it closes out the previous Yovel cycle. But that year 50 does not count as year 1 of the next cycle. Shetei nikras tchilas shnas hashmita haba. So we'll say, so just to appreciate this, we don't really have this yet because we don't have Yovel yet. We don't have Yovel yet. Although again, pretty soon there'll be Yovel also, because again, not all you require, but what you require is Rov Yoshvea Aleha, the majority of Klal Yisrael residing in Eretz Yisrael, and the truth is that scale is going to tip relatively shortly. So it's going to be many incredibly exciting things are going to happen when the majority of Am Yisrael lives in Eretz Yisrael. Already, Abba, you saw the most dramatic thing happen this last Shemitah year. I spoke about this a number of times throughout the year, which is this past Shemitah year saw the greatest number of farmers observing Shemitah since the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. I would say an incredible things. More, again, we didn't understand what that means. More farmers observing Shemitah since the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. It's incredible. So we'll say, so in any event, what the Gemara is saying over here is like this. In the agricultural cycle, we're used to thinking about things in like 7 year, in Shemitah cycles. The truth is, in the agricultural cycle, things are really looked at as part of the Yovel cycle. Right? In other words, the agricultural cycle works on a 50-year cycles. 50-year cycles. So remember, again, this is also important because remember, also in Yovel, you have certain, we'll call it real estate transactions that are reversed as well. Okay, well, we'll get into more of that. In any event, so what the Gemara says is like this. The Yovel year, the 50th year, is the closeout of that cycle. But the Yovel year does not count as year 1 of the next cycle. Now, I will say, remember, why is there this tension? Why is there a tension? There's a tension because year 50 is technically what? First year of the next cycle. Right? Just on a point, right? So that's why there's this tension. Therefore, the Gemara says, no. The 50th year is the 50th year, the close of the Yovel cycle. It is not year 1 of the next Shemitah cycle. Okay, Rabbi Huda says, no. Yovel Ola Leminyan Shavua. Rabbi Huda disagrees. And Rabbi Huda holds that Allah Lamaisa. I'm sorry, did I move?
No, the camera moved.
Okay. Oh, what a good answer. The camera moved. Yes, excellent. Good. So Rabbi Huda says, no, Yovel counts for both. Yovel ultimately, again, is the close of the previous agricultural cycle. And Yovel also is the beginning, year number 1 of the next Shemitah cycle. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, Yovel could actually operate in both capacities. Look at the rush again. Rabbi Yehuda suffered Yovel hias tchilas shvias haba hilchach rabbanon aser b'shnas hayovel Rabbi Yehuda motor. So what says now? Listen to this. Okay, so before we go on, so you have now this fundamental machlokas in the nature of Yovel. Is Yovel simply the closeout for the, what we'll call it, the previous agricultural cycle, and not year 1, therefore not year 1 of the next cycle? Or Yovel, now again, the truth is, everyone agrees that Yovel is the closeout of the previous cycle. The shaila is it also year number 1 of the next cycle? So Rabbi Huda says, you could essentially dual purpose Yovel. It's the closeout of the previous cycle, and ultimately, again, year number 1 of the next cycle. Now, I will say, the reason why this makes a difference is because halacha l'maisa, what happens if a person says, konam yayin she'eni toeim liyovel? So now, I'm not going to drink wine for a Yovel. So I will say, so what's the shaila? When does that neder end? So according to the Rabbanon, when does the neder end? The neder goes through the Yovel year because the Yovel year is part of this current cycle. It could very well be that according to Rabbi Yehuda, right, the neder actually ends at the Yovel year. It doesn't include the Yovel year. Why? Why? Because the Yovel year also is part of what? The next cycle. And because it's part of the next cycle, therefore, halacha l'maisa, you could drink wine during that year. Okay, so that's the Gemara's quoting over here. Now, I will say, once we got into this machlokas, the Gemara is going to spend a little bit of time on this. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, good. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So the Rabbanan said Rabbi Yehuda. So let's remember again. So the Rabbanan are saying Yovel is part of the current agricultural cycle, does not count the year as year 1 of the next cycle. Rabbi Yehuda says, I agree, it's part of the current agricultural cycle, but it also counts as year 1 of the next cycle. So Rabbi Yehuda says, said Rabbi Yehuda, Harehu Omer, Sheish Shanim Tizra Sadecha, Ve'ein Kar Elochamesh. They will say, here's the problem, watch this. This is Rabbi Yehuda, I'll tell you why you're wrong. Because what does the pasuk say? How does the Shemitah cycle work? 6 years you're allowed to plow your field, and year number 7 you can't. Well, if you hold that the Yovel year counts as the first year of the next cycle, Shavuos, let's play this out. Therefore, year 1 of what we'll call cycle number 8, year 1 of cycle number 8 is Yovel. What can you do with your field during Yovel? What do you do with your field during Yovel? Nothing. It's just like a Shemitah year. So we'll say that's going to mean that in cycle number 8, you only have 5 plowable years, right? Because year 1 is Yovel, then you have year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And then ultimately year 7 is Shemitah again. So there's only 5 years there's only 5 plowable years. But the pasuk, when it speaks about Shemitah, tells you that you're going to have 6 plowable years, which is a proof to say that Yovel does not count as year 1 of cycle number 8, but rather Yovel only counts as part of the previous cycle. So Amar Lahem, so Rabbi Yehuda says, I can say back to you, L'Divrechem, according to Rabbanon, Harei Omer, V'astes HaTvua L'Shalosh Shanim. They will say, watch this. The pasuk says by year number 6 in the Shemitah cycle, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us enough wheat, enough crop for 3 years. We'll say, why 3 years? Year 6, 7, and then I will say the post-Shemitah year number 8, you also need crop until the new crop comes in. But according to you, Rabbanon, ultimately again, Harei Kan Arba. In the Yovel year, you need for 4 years, right? You must remember again, Yovel is like a Shemitah year, which means in year number 6, you're going to need, I should say, really, it's in year 48, right? In year 48, you're going to need for 48, That's right, that's the 6th year. You're going to need 49, that's the Shemitah year. You're going to need year 50, that's the Yovel year. And you're going to need year 51, which is again, according to the Rabbanon, year number 1 of cycle number 8. So what do you do with the pasuk? So I'll say, rather what you have to say is Ela li'ika lo'ukma b'shar shani shavua. Dili nami ika lo'ukma b'shar shani shavua. We'll say, rather what you have to say is that these psukim of Sheish Shanim Tizra Sadecha or Vasises Atvol Shalosh Shanim are talking about regular non-Yovel cycles, which is the majority of time. So the psukim themselves, you're right, the Yovel year, we'll say, and if you think about it, we'll say, it's absolutely incredible. In the Yovel year, that year number 6 or year number 48, you have to have 4 times as much produce. It's actually quite incredible because you've got essentially 2 back-to-back Shemitah years. I would say, so in any event, what Rabbi Yehuda is going to say is it has to be that what? It has to be that halacha l'maisa, those psukim are referring to non-Yovel years. Good. So if Rabbi say halacha l'maisa, the Gemara seems to indicate that if you go ahead and, I don't think the Ran even goes ahead. I don't know what the Ran brings down over here. He doesn't bring, the Ran himself doesn't bring down a halacha l'maisa. So I will say, so it sounds like over here, if you went ahead and you made a neder, ultimately, again, I'm not going to drink wine for a Yovel. Does that neder include the Yovel year? Not include the Yovel year. The Gemara wants to suggest that halacha l'maisa, that's part of the machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbana, which I will say is a fantastic machlokas. So again, let's be on the machlokas just a moment. How do you view year number 50? Is year number 50, the Yovel year, considered to be, is it attached to the previous cycle, the close of the previous cycle, but has nothing to do with, we'll call it the 8th cycle of Shemitah? Or no, perhaps year number, that's the Rabbanon, or Rabbi Yehuda, year 50 kind of has a dual identity. It closes out, it's considered to be year 50, the closeout of the previous cycle, and it also counts as what? Year number 1 of the next cycle. So ultimately, I will say the Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon that Yovel Eino Ola Leminyan Shavua. The Rambam paskins that the Yovel year is the closeout of the 7 previous cycles, but the Yovel year does not count as year number 1 of the next cycle. So I will say, so essentially, just how you would realize it in the year of a Yovel, you'd have year 48, which is essentially the 6th year of the 7th Shemitah cycle. I'm sorry. Yes, you'd have then year 49, which is the 7th Shemitah. Year 50, which is then Yovel. Stop. Then I will say what would happen? Then would be year number 1. Then would be year number 1, which essentially, again, the clock starts again. But for illustrative purposes, it would be year number 1 of the 8th cycle. Incredible. Let's go back to Ada Pesach Aser. So I will say, so if you remember again, going back to the Mishnah, we had an interesting case here. So the Mishnah said, Ad HaPesach. If a person makes a neder not to drink wine Ad HaPesach. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Asr Ad Shiagia. Okay, so we'll say in that case, everyone agreed. What does Ad HaPesach mean? It means ultimately until Pesach comes. Now, what happens if you say Ad Shiyehe until it is Pesach? Asr Ad Shiyetze. Okay, fine. Now we'll say, where's the machlokes case? Ad Lifnei HaPesach. What happens if a person says up until Lifnei HaPesach? So what does that mean? Rabbi Meir said, Asr Ad Shiagia. Rabbi Meir says, Ad Lifnei means up until the beginning of Pesach. Rabbi Yossi says, Asr Ad Shiyetze. Ultimately, again, until Pesach is over. Until Pesach is over. Okay. So Rabbi says, so now watch this. So now it says the Gemara, the Memra, to Rabbi Meir Savar, Lo Ma'ayel Inish Lev Shesega. Now Rabbi say, let's talk about this just a moment. So here's the case. Before we turn the page, here's the case. Right? Ad Sheyagia. Right? I'm sorry. What was the Lashon over here? Ad Lifnei HaPesach. That was the Lashon. The Agos V'Tziyunim changed this a little bit. He said, really it means Ad Pnei HaPesach. Right? Ad Pnei HaPesach. So I'll say, what does Ad Pnei HaPesach mean? Rabbi Meir says it means up until the beginning of the Yom Tov. Rabbi Yossi says it means until the end of the Yom Tov. Now I will say, Rabbi Yossi doesn't literally mean that Ad Pnei HaPesach means up until the end of Yom Tov. What does he mean? What does he say? It could mean that. It could mean that. So since it could mean that, we're going to extend the neder until the end of it because it could mean that. So I will say, so what's unfolding over here, the fundamental machlokes what's over here is, do we assume that people are ambiguous with their lashonos? or do we assume that people are precise with their lashonos? That's the real machlokes over here. So watch this. It says the Gemara. So the Memra, the Rabbi Meir Savar lo ma'ayil inish nafshi l'sveika on the base. Rabbi Meir holds a person does not say ambiguous lashon. Therefore, at Pnei Pesach must mean what? Up until the start of Pesach. A person doesn't say things in an ambiguous fashion. Ultimately, Rabbi Yossi Sav, Rabbi Yossi on the other hand holds ma'ayil inish nafshi l'sveika. Rabbi Yossi says no. People do say ambiguous things, and therefore, again, Ad Pnei Pesach means what? Up until the end of Pesach. To which the Gemara says, Raminu, is that really true? What the Gemara is going to say is, in other words, so right now we're saying, Rabbi Meir holds, people don't make ambiguous statements. And therefore, when something sounds ambiguous, we assume they still meant something precise, and therefore we'll interpret it that way. Rabbi Yosef says, no, people do make ambiguous statements, and therefore, again, we're going to have to go ahead and explain those statements in kind of the most expansive way possible. So the Gemara says, is that true? Or minhu? So listen to this. This is such a great case. Mishi yeshlo shtei kitei banos, mishtei nashim. So here we go. This guy, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain has 2 wives and 2 groups of daughters from both wives. Okay. You already know this is a disaster before we go any further. Let's supposed to say, now watch this. V'amar, listen to this. Kidashti es biti hagedola. So the guy says, I know that I betrothed my oldest daughter. Ve'ini yodea. Here's the only problem is, I don't know which daughter it was. It happens, I will say. Right? There was a big breakfast by Daf Yomi, right? In other words, you're having a conversation with someone. You've got a son, I've got a daughter. Let's just lock this down. Right? So, but then I saw jelly donuts, very, very easily distracted. Right? So now watch this. So he says, so he went ahead and he knows that he was Mekadesh, his Biti Gidola, my older daughter. I just don't know which daughter I had in mind. Now, both say, now watch this. They both say, now here's the ambiguity. Stuff happens. Here's the ambiguity. Im gidola shebigdolos, im gidola shebiktanas. So both say, now remember again, why is this case confusing? Because Ruvain has 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. By the way, listen, we have not mentioned Ruvain, Rachel, and Leah since our Yavamas days, right? This is like a Yavamas throwback. So now watch this. So now, remember, he's got, let's say for argument's sake, Ruvain has 2 daughters with Rachel, 2 daughters with Leah. Now let's just, for illustrative purposes, let's assume he married Rachel first and then Leah. So watch this. And let's assume for a moment that the order of the daughters are Rachel's daughter A, daughter B, Leah, daughter C, daughter D. Okay, so Rachel's daughters are older than Leah's daughters. Okay, now watch this. So he says, I know that I betrothed my older daughter. Now, older daughter can mean a lot in this context. It can mean, maybe it means the oldest of Rachel's daughters. Or maybe it means what? The firstborn of Leah's daughters. Or maybe it means or maybe it means Rachel's second daughter, who's still older than what? Leah's 2 daughters. Shehu gidola min hagdola shebiktanas. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, so essentially, first of all, a lot going on in this case, right? So first of all, number 1, Ruvain, you probably should sleep elsewhere tonight, right? That's number 1, right? Number 2, I'll say, so what do we do? So Kula Nasos Rameir. Rameir says the truth is, all of the daughters are aser, except for one. Chutz minaktanas shebiktanos. So Rabbi say who? Now, the only girl who for sure is not betrothed, Rabbi says who? The youngest of Leah's daughters. Right? The youngest of Leah's daughters. The youngest daughter. Because she's not a Gedola, right? She's not older than anyone. So let's remember again, let's go through this, right? Remember, he married Rachel before Leah. Rachel's 2 daughters are older than Leah's 2 daughters. So remember again, it could be Rachel's firstborn, because she's the oldest. It could be Rachel's secondborn, because her secondborn is still what? Older than Leah's 2 daughters. It could be Leah's firstborn, because she's older than Leah's secondborn, but it can't be Leah's second daughter. Okay, so the only one for sure who is not included in this is Leah's second daughter. So we'll say, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi says, Kula matars. No. All of them are mutar. No. What does oldest daughter mean? Ruvain's oldest daughter. Who's Ruvain's oldest daughter? Rachel's firstborn. So I will say, so by the way, now what do you see from here? The shitos are flipped. So I will say, in this case, Rabbi Meir is the one who assumes that people make ambiguous lashonos, and therefore again is going to go ahead and ultimately, and I'm sorry. Rabbi Meir is the one who says that all of them are asr except for the youngest one. So you see from here that Rabbi Meir ultimately again says that people make ambiguous lashonos, versus Rabbi Yossi who says that people don't make ambiguous statements. Rather, again, he must have meant his oldest daughter. So I will say this is the opposite of the way it's framed in our Mishnah. To which the Gemara says, "Chanina bar Abdimi Amarav Muchlefes Hashita Ina Chinami Sutra on the Mishnah." And therefore, I will say in our Mishnah also. In our Mishnah, it should read that if you said Ad Pnei Pesach, Rabbi Meir holds that you're usher through the end of Pesach. Rabbi Yossi says you're only usher up until the beginning of Pesach. Switch the sheet. That's Aiva Tanya. So I will say again, a Bryce that supports this. Ze'aklal Kol Shezmano Kavua Va'amar Ad Lipnei. So ultimately, again, anything that has a set time, like Pesach, and you said Ad Lipnei, Rabbi Meir Omer Ad Shiyetze. Rabbi Meir says you're usher through the end of the Yom Tiv. Rabbi Yossi Omer Ad Shiagia. Rabbi Yossi says ultimately again you're only usher up until the arrival. So Rabbi say so indeed. What we end up doing is switching the lashonos. And Rabbi say it turns out that Rabbi Meir is the opinion that holds people do make ambiguous lashonos, and therefore if you say konem yayin she'eni toim ad pnei haPesach, Rabbi Meir interprets that the neder is you are asked to drink wine until when? Until the end of Pesach. Just like Rabbi Meir would say that halacha l'maisa, in this case of Ruvain, if Ruvain betrothed his oldest daughter and he's not sure which one he did, who's aser? All of them are aser except for the youngest of the youngest, mamish, the youngest girl. Rabbi Yossi on the other hand says, if you make a neder konin yain she'enin toim ad pnei Pesach, Rabbi Yossi will say you're aser up until the beginning of Pesach. And in this case, where you betrothed an older daughter, which daughter is betrothed? Which daughter? Only the oldest daughter of Rachel. Because Rabbi Yossi holds people don't make ambiguous statements, and therefore we interpret what appear to be ambiguous statement in a specific way. First, Rabbi Meir who says people do make ambiguous statements, and therefore again you have to interpret the statements l'chumrah. Incredible. Rabbi say weiter. Ada kotzir, ada botzir, ada masik. Here we go. A person goes ahead and says, same case, any konim yayin, or any toim yayin, or konam, any toim yayin, I'm not going to drink wine until when? Ada kotzir. Rabbi say kotzir means the wheat harvest. Botzir means the grape harvest. Masik means the olive harvest. So what's the halacha? Eino asr ela ad shiyagia. You're only asr up until the time of the harvest arrives. So in other words, Rabbi say, what's the havamina? The havamina is that maybe I should be asr when? Through the end of the harvest? No, you're only asr up until the time that the harvest arrives. Ze'aklal. So Rabbi says what we just mentioned before. This is the rule. Kol shezmano kavua. Anything that has a set time. Va'amar ad shiyagia. And you framed your neder as I will be asr up until the arrival of this event. Asr ad shiyagia. Ultimately, again, the isr only applies until the arrival of the event. Amar ad shiyehei. I will say, but if you use the lashon of, let's say, I will not drink wine ad shiyehei until it will be, or until it is, asr ad shiyetze. You are asr through the conclusion of the event. So I will say, so just to give you an example, right? So if you were to go ahead and say, let me use Pesach for just a moment, because Pesach is a good example of zmano kavua. So if a person says, konam yayin she'eni toim, right, ad ha-Pesach, or ad shiagia ha-Pesach, I can't drink wine until when? Up until the arrival of Pesach. Once Pesach arrives, I can drink wine. If you were to say, konam yayin she'eni toim, ad sheyehei ha-Pesach, until it is Pesach, then what? I'm also to drink wine when? Through the end of Pesach. That's with something that is zmano kavua, has a set time. On the other hand, the choshein zmano kavua, what happens if you have something that doesn't have a set time? So what's the halacha? Bein amar ad shiyehei, bein amar ad shiyagia, eino aser ela ad shiyagia. So we'll say, so again, if something doesn't have a set time, then halacha l'maisa what? Then halacha l'maisa, whether you said ad shiyehei or ad shiyagia, you're only asr up until the beginning of that particular event. Fine. So we'll define that a bit more. Adakayitz, what happens if you say, now Adakayitz is the fig harvest. The fig harvest. So what if I said, same case, I'm not going to drink wine up until the beginning, up until the fig harvest. Ad Sheyehei HaKayitz. So what does that mean? So, I'm sorry, lost the place. Adakayitz. Ad Sheyehei HaKayitz. So I'll say ultimately again, if you said I'm not going to drink wine, ultimately again, up until the fig harvest, or Ad Sheyehei HaKayitz. So what does that mean? Ad Sheyaschilu Ha'am L'Hachnis B'Kalkalos. So whether you said Adakayitz or Ad Sheyehei HaKayitz, you're only usher up until the time where people begin to put figs into their baskets. Right? So at the time of this, when does the fig harvest begin? When people begin to put figs into their baskets, that's the duration of the neder. Ad Sheyavor HaKayitz, if you say, you make it, the way you frame the neder is, I'm not going to drink wine until when? Until the kayitz is over. Ad Sheyavor HaKayitz, right? Then Ad Sheyikpelu HaMikutzaos. You are not permitted to drink wine up until they put away their knives. So if you look at, no, nothing yet. Fine. Until they put away their knives. So apparently, again, if you look at the Ran says over here, he says, Ad sheyikpelu ha'mekutzos, hasakinim shemiyuchadum lachtoch ha'te'inim kishos menegulin nikra mekutzos. These were the knives that ultimately, again, they would cut up the figs with. Now, I will say the truth is, these weren't knives necessarily just used to harvest. These were actually knives that were used to cut the figs to make them into cakes of pressed figs. That's what the Ran points out over here. He says, Nikra mikutzos v'chi ashkechan fine. So I will say, so ultimately, so this is actually very interesting. So if you just say, Adakayitz or Ad Sheyehei HaKayitz, so when is that neder in effect until? Ad sheyaschilu ha'am l'hachnis b'kalkalos. When the people begin to put figs in their baskets. But if you phrase the neder as Ad Sheyavor HaKayitz, I won't drink wine until when? Until the fig harvest season is over. When is the fig harvesting season over? When people put away their fig knives. Then the harvest season is over. So says the Gemara Tana, when we speak about the fact, when the Gemara said that if a person made a neder, I'm not going to drink wine until the fig harvest season begins. So the Mishnah said, when does the fig season begin? Or when does the season begin? When people begin to put things into their basket. Shabbos say, now the Brisa says, when we say the basket, it means a basket of figs, v'lo kal kala shalanavim, not a basket of grapes. So Tanya, hanoder miperos hakayitz, if a person makes a neder not to eat the peros of the kayitz, of the harvest, ein asra ela b'te'inim, he's only asra to eat figs. Shirley says, anavim bechlal te'inim. No, grapes are included in figs, and therefore if you make a neder not to go ahead and eat the fruit of the kayitz, so we'll say, what's interesting about this is as follows. There's a different term used for fig harvest than for grape harvest, right? Remember again, grape harvest is called batzir, fig harvest is called kayitz. What's interesting over here is there some level of interchangeability in terms? So the way this conversation started is like this. If I make a neder, I'm not going to drink wine up until the kayitz, right? So until when am I not allowed to drink wine? What did the Mishnah say? Until when? Until people begin placing things into their baskets. Now we assumed the things that the Mishnah refers to are what? Figs. The Bryce now comes along and says, it only means figs, not grapes. Now there's a second opinion that says, no, it means grapes also. Why? Because apparently there's a school of thought that says there's some level of interchangeability between grapes and figs. For example, if a person says, I make a neder, I'm not going to eat peros hakayis. So what's included in that? So the first opinion said, Tanakama said it's only figs. Shmuel says, no, it's also grapes. My time at the Tanakama. What's the reason Tanakama? Kasavar te'inam mikatitzin biada, anavim lo mikatitzin biada. So what's very interesting? Tanakama says because there's no figs and grapes are reckoned separately. Why? Because they're harvested differently. How are they harvested differently? Figs apparently are harvested by hand. Rabbi said that's why. By the way, the Ran said that even though we said before that if you make a neder not to go ahead and drink wine until the end of the fig season, when's the end of the fig season, fig harvest season? When is that? When they put away their knives. That's why the Ran said, what are the knives used for? To cut the figs, make them into cake or pressed figs. It's not used for harvest. Figs are actually harvested by hand. they're harvested by hand. Versus grapes, which are often harvested ultimately again, not with a knife or with some type of utensil, not by hand. So that's why Tanakama says, therefore again, if you make a neder, nati peros hakayitz, it only refers to figs, doesn't refer to grapes, because they're fundamentally harvested differently. Rabbi Shimon on the other hand holds, anovim nami kimirardon mikatzatsan biyada. So Rabbi Shimon says on the other hand, that halacha l'maisa, he says over here, anovim kimirardon, or miradidon. The Ran says, when ultimately again, the stems of the grapes dry out, they're often also cut by knife. Rashi, the Ran says, I'm sorry, not by hand. Okay, so interestingly enough, it's fascinating. It seems to be that the reason why grapes aren't normally harvested by knife is because since the stem is moist, so it'll be harder to do it by knife versus by hand. Ultimately, again, I'm sorry, just the opposite. Right? The grapes are normally harvested by knife because the stems are moist. And therefore, to get that off by hand, you run the risk of ruining the grapes. However, so therefore, again, the Tanakama will say that if you go ahead and you make a neder that says, I'm not going to eat peros hakayitz dafka refers to figs, because figs are harvested differently than grapes. What Rav Shmuel says, yeah, normally figs are harvested differently than grapes, but lamaisa, by grapes also, when the stem dries out, ultimately, then you could even go ahead and harvest it by hand. So there is a time when figs and grapes are harvested the same way, and therefore, if you made a neder that says, I'm not going to eat peros kayitz, it could also include grapes as well. Good, I will say. So again, we're not finished. It's much more to do in this. We'll stop over for today. We're actually going to happen a few minutes of Mesilas Yesharim. So I will say, so just again, tomorrow we're also davening 7:15 Shirat V'Zvasai. Tomorrow, ridiculous Gemara. Ridiculous. Right? Too good. Mamish, too. Almost like we haven't earned it. That's how good a Gemara like this. A little bit of Agarata tomorrow. Fascinating halacha. Rabbi says to a little Mesilas Yesharim. A little Mesilas Yesharim.